This is Chapter 23, Module 3, Respiratory Diffusion and Transport of Gases. The learning objectives of this module are 1. Summarize the physical principles governing the diffusion of gases into and out of the blood and body tissues. 2. Describe the structure and function of hemoglobin and the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood. And 3. Explain the mechanism of respiratory control and factors that may influence it. Gas exchange occurs across the respiratory membrane between the blood and the alveolar air, as well as between the blood and the interstitial space. Gas exchange depends on the partial pressure of the gases to allow the diffusion of the gas molecules between the gas and the liquid. Diffusion occurs in response to concentration gradients. That is, gases will move from higher gas concentrations to lower gas concentrations. The rate of diffusion depends on gas laws. One gas law is called Dalton's law. This law identifies the composition of gases in the air and determines that each gas in air exerts a pressure that combined produces the atmospheric pressure. Each gas contributes to the total pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury and is proportional to its number of molecules. The pressure contributed by each gas in the atmosphere is the partial pressure. Therefore, oxygen exerts a partial pressure of around 159 millimeters of mercury, which is 20.9% of the total 760 millimeters of mercury in atmospheric pressure. All partial pressures add up to 760 millimeters of mercury. The direction and rate of diffusion of carbon dioxide and oxygen across the respiratory membrane is determined in large part by the different partial pressures between the blood and the alveoli and the blood and the tissues. This exchange of gases across the respiratory membrane is very efficient for several reasons. First, there is a substantial difference in partial pressures across the respiratory membrane. Second, the distances involved in the gas exchange are short. Third, oxygen and carbon dioxide are lipid-soluble, making it easy to diffuse. Fourth, the total surface area of a respiratory membrane is large. And fifth, the blood flow and airflow are coordinated. Blood that arrives at the pulmonary arteries has a low partial pressure of oxygen of 40 millimeters of mercury. Conversely, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high at 45 millimeters of mercury because the tissues produced carbon dioxide as a waste product during metabolism and the carbon dioxide diffused into the blood returning to the lungs. At the lungs, the low partial pressure of oxygen will cause oxygen to diffuse into the blood where the partial pressure of oxygen is higher. In other words, the partial pressure of oxygen is 100 millimeters of mercury in the alveoli and only 40 millimeters of mercury in the pulmonary capillaries arriving at the alveoli, so oxygen molecules will diffuse into the blood. Also, the high partial pressures of carbon dioxide will cause the carbon dioxide molecules to leave the blood and diffuse into the alveoli. The carbon dioxide partial pressure in the blood arriving at the alveoli is 45 millimeters of mercury. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli is 40 millimeters of mercury. Carbon dioxide will diffuse across the respiratory membrane and into the alveoli. This rapid exchange allows blood and alveolar air to reach equilibrium. As blood leaves the lung, the oxygen partial pressure will be 100 millimeters of mercury, and the carbon dioxide partial pressure will be 40 millimeters of mercury. The pulmonary veins carry the blood to the heart, and the heart ejects the blood into the systemic circuit. By the time the blood reaches the systemic circuit, the partial pressure of oxygen drops slightly to 95 millimeters of mercury as it mixes with the blood in the heart. But the partial pressure of carbon dioxide remains the same at 40 millimeters of mercury. The systemic arteries carry the oxygenated blood to the tissues. In the tissues, the partial pressure of oxygen is lower, as the tissues have been using oxygen to create energy. The partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues is 40 millimeters of mercury. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide is higher in the tissues as the metabolic processes produced carbon dioxide as a waste product. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the tissues is 45 millimeters of mercury. The concentration gradient between oxygen in the systemic arteries, which is 95 millimeters of mercury, and the tissues at 40 millimeters of mercury causes oxygen to diffuse out of the blood and into the tissues. The concentration gradient between carbon dioxide in the systemic arteries at 40 millimeters of mercury and the tissues at 45 millimeters of mercury will cause carbon dioxide to diffuse into the blood, where it can be transported back to the lungs to be exhaled and removed from the body. The rapid exchange allows the blood and the tissues to reach equilibrium so that the blood returning to the lungs has a partial pressure of oxygen at 40 millimeters of mercury and a partial pressure of carbon dioxide at 45 millimeters of mercury. As oxygen and carbon dioxide travel in the blood, they will be transported either in the plasma or in the red blood cells. In the red blood cells, most oxygen molecules will be transported in the red blood cells by the hemoglobin molecules. Oxygen binds to the iron ions in the hemoglobin molecules. This new molecule is now called oxyhemoglobin. The binding is reversible. Each red blood cell has about 280 million hemoglobin molecules, and each red blood cell binds to 4 oxygen molecules. Therefore, each red blood cell can carry over 1 billion oxygen molecules. The percentage of heme units in a hemoglobin molecule that contains bound oxygen is called hemoglobin saturation. There are 4 factors that affect the saturation of hemoglobin: the partial pressure of the blood, the pH of the blood, the temperature of the blood, and the metabolic activity within the red blood cells. This graph illustrates the relationship between the saturation of hemoglobin to the partial pressure of oxygen. The higher the oxygen partial pressure, the greater the hemoglobin saturation curve is. The line is curved rather than straight, because each time an oxygen is bound to a hemoglobin molecule, it makes it easier for the next oxygen to bind. Temperature and pH will affect this saturation curve. When the temperature rises or the pH drops, more oxygen is released, shifting the curve to the right. Meaning, if the tissues have a higher temperature and a lower pH, the tissues require more oxygen, so hemoglobin releases oxygen so it can diffuse into the tissues. Conversely, when the pH rises or the temperature drops, less oxygen is released and the hemoglobin stays bound to oxygen, shifting the curve to the left. Carbon dioxide is generated as a byproduct or waste product in the cells of the body during aerobic metabolism or cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide will be transported in the blood back to the lungs where it can be exhaled. Carbon dioxide can be carried in the bloodstream in 3 ways: converted to carbonic acid, bound to hemoglobin within red blood cells, or dissolved in the plasma. 70% of carbon dioxide is transported in the blood as carbonic acid, whereas 23% of carbon dioxide is bound to hemoglobin and only 7% is dissolved in plasma. Several factors help to maintain gas diffusion at the alveoli. Gas diffusion can be maintained by changes in the blood flow, by the amount of oxygen delivered to the alveoli, and by changes in the depth and rate of respiration. This regulation occurs either locally at the lungs or more centrally in the control centers of the brain. Locally, shifting the blood flow to the lungs involves the coordination of lung perfusion and alveolar ventilation. Lung perfusion is the ratio of the amount of air reaching the alveoli to the amount of blood reaching the alveoli. The regulation of blood flow locally at the lungs occurs when carbon dioxide partial pressures rise and the smooth muscles in the arterioles and capillaries relax, causing vasodilation that causes increased blood flow. This increased blood flow will get more blood to the alveoli so that more carbon dioxide can diffuse into the alveoli and be exhaled. This is an example of increasing lung perfusion. Alveolar ventilation is the volume of gas expired from the alveoli to the outside of the body per minute. Alveolar ventilation can be increased locally by controlling bronchoconstriction and bronchodilation. Bronchodilation will bring more air to the alveoli, and bronchoconstriction will bring less air to the alveoli. More central regulation occurs in the respiratory centers in the brain. When oxygen demands rise, cardiac output and respiratory rates increase under neural control. The respiratory centers consist of 3 pairs of nuclei in the medulla oblongata and the pons. These respiratory centers regulate the respiratory muscles in response to sensory information. The respiratory centers of the medulla oblongata will set the pace of respiration. There are 2 centers in the medulla oblongata, the dorsal respiratory group and the ventral respiratory group. The dorsal respiratory group is the inspiratory center and functions in quiet and forced breathing. This center must be functioning in order for breathing to be formed naturally. The ventral respiratory group is both an inspiratory and expiratory center and functions only in forced breathing. The respiratory centers are strongly influenced by chemoreceptors that are found centrally in the cerebrospinal fluid or peripherally in the aortic and carotid sinuses. The central chemoreceptors in the brain detect levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the cerebrospinal fluid, whereas the chemoreceptors in the aortic and carotid sinuses detect oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in the blood. The carotid bodies are located where the carotid artery branches into the internal and external carotid arteries. The chemoreceptors in the carotid bodies are stimulated by changes in blood pH or changes in the partial pressure of oxygen. The chemoreceptors of the carotid bodies stimulate the glossopharyngeal nerve to relay information to the respiratory centers. The vagus nerve carries the same information from the chemoreceptors in the aortic bodies. When the chemoreceptors are stimulated, this leads to an increased depth and rate of respiration. The most important chemical regulator of respiration is carbon dioxide. A 10% increase in the level of carbon dioxide will increase the rate of breathing. The chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata become stimulated with an increase in carbon dioxide. An increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is called hypercapnia. The most common cause of hypercapnia is hypoventilation, or abnormally low respiration rate. This allows carbon dioxide to build up in the blood. Clinically, hypoventilation can occur when a person is awakening from anesthesia post-surgery. The chemoreceptors respond by increasing the rate of respiration. Conversely, excessive ventilation or hypoventilation can cause hypocapnia, or abnormally low carbon dioxide in the blood. Hypocapnia would stimulate the chemoreceptors to decrease the respiratory rate. Baroreceptors in the carotid and aortic sinuses also affect respiration. When blood pressure falls, respiration will increase. When blood pressure increases, respiration decreases. This ends Chapter 23, Module 3, Respiratory Diffusion and Transport of Gases.